If you're a fantasy football degenerate like the rest of us, you probably love drafting your team, but hate managing it. Don't worry, that just means that best ball is for you. We're going to talk to someone who knows all about best ball, the ups and downs, the ins and outs for beginning, intermediate level play, and those advanced players. And we'll do that now. Welcome into the double FU, the FU times two. I am Jeremy Schulman at FF_Rebel. And we, if you haven't noticed, I'm going to point the other direction here, have a special guest today. By matter of introduction, this is Tom Strachan. I believe I pronounced that right, Tom. I meant to ask you that before the show.
Absolutely perfect. And not many people get it
Nice.
first time.
Awesome. Well, I did a little matter of deduction that you have NFL_T-Strack for your Twitter handle. And also, I did live in the UK for 5 years. So I have a small bit of, knowledge of how we live on the other side of the pond. And of course, I'm in Amsterdam now. But just to introduce you for maybe the one person who might possibly see this, who knows the FFU and doesn't know you, Tom Strachan is a writer and podcast editor for Fantasy Pros. You can find him over there. He's on that site daily, it seems, posting a ridiculous amount of content over there for them. He's the co-creator of the FF Sanctuary, which I know is on YouTube. I think they're all over the map everywhere else, talking about best ball and everything else you need to know. And he's a self-professed best ball sicko. It lives in these best ball streets. So, who better to talk best ball with than the man himself, who's living, eating, breathing all of these things best ball. So, Tom, thank you so much, and the warmest of double FUs to you. Thanks for coming on the show.
No, I'll appreciate that. Very kind intro. And, I just, it's great to be able to chat with you guys. I see how much you guys are grinding out the content. I see the good production values that you guys have got, do everything right. And I really believe that in a year or two's time, you guys are going to have a huge following. So it's great to be on here with you today.
Thanks, Tom. Appreciate you saying that, man. Let's just jump right into this because, I was just mentioning to you pre-show here how over, in Amsterdam or in the UK, we don't necessarily have access to Underdog. That's something that Underdog, if you ever see this, please, try to rectify that. I know it's difficult with, international laws and finances and stuff, but playing best ball, Underdog is the main format here. So for someone who maybe doesn't know best ball, let's just give them a brief kind of primer of what is best ball and how does it differ from your standard redraft league.
So at its simplest, best ball's draft and forget fantasy football. It's all about the draft. There's no waivers, there's no trades, none of that lineup setting. Every week you draft, typically on most platforms, you're talking 18 to 20 roster spots. And then every week the system will just work out the optimal lineup for you. And that's the lineup you've got. For anyone who's not played it, that might sound a little bit like, okay, well, the waivers and everything is you're taking the fun, you're taking the strategy out of it. But because everything focuses simply on the draft, that means that the draft becomes so much more strategic. And then as you expand further within best ball, there's multiple different types. You've got season-long self-contained leagues. So that's like your standard kind of sleeper leagues where if you're playing just against 12 people, and that league will run weeks 1 to 17, and then the most points at the end will typically be the winner. You've also got Dynasty Best Ball, which is a great way to cope if you're playing with a large amount of Dynasty rosters. Like I think I'm like over 20 Dynasty teams, and having 4 or 5, 6 Dynasty Best Ball teams, it just alleviates, okay, well, I don't need to set a lineup for that one, but it's still got all the Dynasty strategy and theory there, so you can still build for the long term, you can still trade, so there's all that. But the area where most content is tailored towards and the area where most people who are obsessed with best ball spend most of the time is the big tournament best ball. So you might have heard of Underdog's Best Ball Mania or DraftKings Millie Maker contest. There's all these kind of massive contests where you can be winning millions of dollars, hundreds of thousands, even for not coming in first place. And each one of them there's an art to understanding the contest you're in, because if we're taking on a contest where we're only allowed one entry or three entries, we want to approach it differently to a contest where we might be allowed up to 150 entries. So yeah, I mean, we can start with best ball from the lowest point of just throwing in one entry, but then you can easily become obsessed with it to the point I am, where I'll just draft as many teams as possible and really obsess over the micro details of everything.
No, that's amazing. And I think, yeah, you mentioned Dynasty. I'm in a couple of Dynasty best ball leagues. I like that because I don't need to pay attention to it as much. But trading does become more interesting for sure. And we always preach to people, and I'm sure you do too, that, no matter what league you're in, you want to know your draft settings. Certainly. So best ball is kind of the same way, where you're just prepping for the draft. That's like a hyper focus on the draft settings and then the future of what everything might become. So yeah, it's definitely a different type of game. Let's talk to the beginner best ball. Somebody who's getting into it, who's only in a league or two. What's one or two strategies that you have in mind that you think everybody needs to understand and then try to employ in their drafts?
So the first one would be roster strategies, and you'll hear a lot about these. Like I'm talking about hero RB, zero RB, robust RB, things like that, dual RB starts. And it can be easy when you first start playing fantasy, or if you're not as deep in the weeds as some of us, to go, okay, well, I'm just going to pick the best players. It's like, okay, great, that's fantastic. I don't know why I didn't think of that if it was that easy, but it's been
Yeah.
proven. Like we've got years and years of data over the course of
Mhm.
like the last 5 years now that shows if you employ certain strategies and if you using them correctly, then your advance rates in terms of advancing through the best ball playoffs to the finals are going to be improved. So hero RB, that's one running back in the first two rounds, no more till after round 5. Zero running back, no running back before round 6. Excuse me, dual running back, two running backs back to back to start the draft. And there's loads of detail we could get into these, but like I'll let people find that sort of stuff as they go. But just being mindful of how you draft is a big part of this. So going, okay, I could either take lots of running backs or I can spend draft capital on running backs early is a big part. So you're going, okay, I have this many picks. How am I going to use them? And this bleeds into my second strategy, which is pick
Mhm.
allocations, because you've got 20 roster spots and you have to think about, okay, I can allocate this many picks to quarterback, this many picks to running back, but it's also the knock on effect. So if I draft 3 quarterbacks on underdog, there's only 18 rounds. So all of a sudden, if you drafted 2 quarterbacks, you would have been able to allocate that extra roster spot to a running back, a wide receiver, or a tight end. So there's always this balancing spot. We want to be fairly balanced with how we build in some ways. Like the most successful pick allocations on DraftKings have been 3 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 8 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends, or similar, like 2 quarterbacks, 6 running backs, 9 wide receivers, and 3 tight ends. So it's always just going, okay, I have 20 picks or 18 picks. What is the best way for me to spend them? And if you're spending a lot early on one position, it might be that you don't need a lot of them in total, because if the ones at the top of the draft fail, then you're in for a pretty miserable season anyway.
Yeah, and to that point, we never know when injury is going to strike. So really, you're as much as possible, you're just assuming that these guys are gonna hit their ceilings, especially in those giant leagues, I assume. But yeah, pick allocation. That's something that even as someone who doesn't play best ball, I've heard that a ton. Adam Levitan, yourself, a lot of people talk about these different strategies and how you want to search for value, but also make sure that you don't overdraft on a particular position. It seems like wide receiver heavy, or at least a ton of wide receivers, like you're also advocating for, is also the way to go. Yeah.
Yeah, and particularly this year because Zero RB crushed last year. Like the winner of Underdog, who won $3 million, was a Zero RB team. The winner of the regular season prize on Underdog's Best Ball Mania was also a Zero RB team. That was like another million. Then you look at various other contests around. I'm fairly sure the winning lineup on Drafters was a Zero RB team. The
Mhm.
winning team on DraftKings was slightly different. They took running backs slightly earlier than the 6th round, but they were scooping players who were falling for reasons like, Jonathan Taylor, who'd been injured. So you were getting a discount on him compared to where he was. But because Zero RB absolutely crushed last year, now we're just seeing more and more wide receivers getting pushed up drafts. So if you haven't drafted already, and there's a lot of people out there who will be just starting to enter the lobbies for the first time, and they'll be finding, wow, there are so many wide receivers at the top of drafts compared to running backs. And in previous years, you go back 3 or 4 years, and you were getting like 7, 8 running backs in the first 2 rounds. Now, if you see more than 5 go in the first 2 rounds, it's a bit of a strange draft. So being prepared for it, looking at, there's so many great tools. Like the one that really sticks out is if you go to fantasylife.com, they have what's called an ADP grid, and you can see what the current ADP is laid out as if it's a draft board. And that'll just help you have an idea of, okay, well, this is the pockets of the draft where wide receivers go heavy here, then the quarterbacks start to go, tight ends go here, running backs in this range. And it just really helps you be a little more prepared for where you go in, because otherwise, if you go into a draft completely unprepared, it's going to be quite a rude awakening to what the ADP is this year.
Yeah, and I don't want to take us completely off the rails, but I have my own theories and thoughts about. I've been a zero RB truther for the last couple of years. I'm not going zero RB this year in redraft. I mean, in best ball, maybe it's a different thing for sure, but I'm concerned about the fact that there's going to be multiple people in the draft room who are going zero RB, and every draft's different. You have to read the room for sure. But in my early startups here, in early mocks, you see a ton of zero RB attempts and builds because it has worked. So I'm just a little concerned about that. Do you have any of those concerns, or is it still because it's best ball, those guys are going to pop off and they're the best choices?
Yeah, there's a little bit of that. I mean, it's such a reactionary game. I mean, fantasy sports in general is such a reactionary game.
Yeah.
And there's always that kind of thing, the year that Pat Corain won Best Ball Mania for $2 million, he did it with a dual RB start. So he had Austin Eckler and Saquon Barkley as his 2 first picks. And the next year, there was plenty of people who tried that. The first year that Underdog was around, it was won by Justin Herzig of Established a Run, and he used what's called a hyper fragile build, where he took 3 running backs in the first 5 picks and then only took 1 more running back throughout the rest of his draft. That's something which since has performed really poorly. But the year after that, everybody was like, well, this is genius. You spend up at running back, and then you use loads of your picks on wide receivers and other positions so that you're kind of still getting there on a quantity over quality side. But this year, I mean, if you start running back, you might end up with Bijan Robinson, Jonathan Taylor, for instance. But it means that your wide receiver 1 is going to end up being Cooper Kupp, Michael Pittman, that kind of range, which is fine if Bijan Robinson and Jonathan Taylor hit in the way which we think their ceiling outcomes can be. And in redraft, I think it's definitely worth doing. Like, I write a lot of stuff, Fantasy Pros, about over the last month. I did a pick by pick series saying, if you're drafting from the 101 in redraft, this is players who are going to be available. This is strategies you might want to employ. These are players you should fade. And as part of that, I spent a lot of time in Fantasy Pros Mock Draft Simulator, which is a great tool. I'm pretty sure it's free and anyone can use it. And you can choose where you're picking from and mock in, 2 minutes. And for me, as somebody who's been drafting, triple figures, best ball teams, to then go into a redraft scenario, the running backs go so much earlier. It'd be like round 4. And I, normally in a best ball draft, I'm looking at Isaiah Pacheco, Travis Etienne, James Cook, that sort of range. But in the redraft one, you're already down to the guys like Ramondre Stevenson, Najee Harris. And I'm like, whoa. I don't need to take them. I can just wait. Like, I put out a video on our channel recently called The Best Area of Drafts to Target Running Backs. And for me, it is in best ball leagues between picks 73 to 110, where if you go back over the last few years, consistently there has been absolute gold in that area of the drafts. And this year we're getting really good targets there. We're talking about guys like David Montgomery, Jonathan Brooks, Brian Robinson, Tony Pollard, Raheem Mostert, guys that could easily pay off massively. But in redraft, those guys are just getting squeezed up. So I think when you dive into redraft, you have to go, okay, well, if I'm only playing in a 15 round draft, which is what a lot of redraft standard leagues are,
Mhm.
I have 25% less than a typical best ball draft. So players are going to get pushed up. In redraft, typically we see people
Fair.
like to fill out the starting lineup ahead of ADP. It's like, right, well, I've got my 3 wide receivers. Now I'm going to get some running backs, even if it's ahead of ADP. So being mindful of the league, that circles back to the contest point that we started with. If you can understand where you're playing, who you're playing against, it's always a massive advantage.
Yeah, totally agree with that. For some of the guys and gals who might be watching who have played best ball for a while, or have played dabbled a little bit, they know the ins and outs, but they're looking to level up. What are some kind of strategies that you think this year, generally, what's going to work for someone who's looking to really gain that edge in best ball and kind of just getting better as a player?
So stacking is a big one, and it became a bit of a hot topic a couple of years ago when every year there's something which catches the best ball audience. Like last year, it was week 17 correlation, which we'll get into in a minute.
Mhm.
The year
Yep.
before that, it was the dead zone.
Yep.
And stacking, it sometimes gets a little overblown. People are reaching too far to get the stacks that they want. People are prioritizing them over taking the best player. But Mike Leone of Established a Run found that, like, out of every underdog draft, 10.5 out of every 12 teams are currently stacking with that's like at
Mhm.
least one quarterback
Wow.
with one pass catcher. And when we talk about stacking, it's kind of important to remember at the crux of it, the reason why it's been so successful and the reason why it's been so successful in DFS is that we're betting on less outcomes. So if you've got a roster of 20 players and you're saying, okay, well, I believe in Lamar Jackson. If I believe in Lamar Jackson, then it makes sense that I believe in some of his pass catches. So
Mhm.
if I want to say, okay, Lamar Jackson's going to go out and have another MVP season, and that's why I'm comfortable taking him in like the third, fourth round, then which of his players are also going to perform to a Pro Bowl level? And then it's going, okay, well, Mark Andrews could probably get there. We know he's a Pro Bowler.
Yep.
Zay Flowers, we know he's an ascending talent. So it's condensing rather than making 20 bets, it's going, okay, well, if I can pile on 3 bets into one, then that leaves me having to get fewer things right. One of the things that Mike Leone also found is that by having all of your quarterbacks on a roster stacked, your teams perform much
Mhm.
better as you went through the finals. You want at least 2 quarterbacks with a stack on them. But one thing that he found is overstacking can be more harmful to your team because essentially, not every game is going to go 55, 60 points as much as we'd like it to. And if the points condense, if one of the pass catchers catches 2 touchdowns and then somebody else is or just getting, 4 catches for 40 yards or 60 yards or so, then they might not make it into your roster and it's not really helping you. So finding the optimal
Mm.
amount, basically for each player, you should be looking for a quarterback and then 1 to 2 pass catchers on the same team. That's a big thing. And I'm still guilty of it. There's definitely times where I'm like, well, no, of course I'm going to take Devontae Walker in the 20th round because
Yeah.
I've got
Yeah.
Lamar, I've got Zay Flowers, I've got Mark
Totally.
Andrews. I'm banking on it.
Yeah.
And it's definitely more efficient to have smaller stacks. But if you can make it to the finals with a large stack, then it also gives you more avenues to go nuclear when you get there. So finding that
Nice.
balance, not overstacking for the sake of it. And then the other one is an offshoot from this is week 17 correlation. So if you're new to best ball, week 17 is all that matters in terms of the money. If you're drafting a 12-person league, and then after weeks 1 to 14, you'll move on to another 12-person league typically, or it might be 18 or 20. Then you progress through, you progress if you're in the top one, the top two, depending on the contest, till eventually you get to the final. The finals, depending on where you're playing. I mean, the DraftKings final this year is 1,021 person final. Last year it was 1,364 people. Last year's
Wow.
Best Ball Mania was 461 people. I might be a little bit off there, but the way that week 17 works, it's essentially a 1 week DFS contest. So now you've made it there. You need enough juice to be able to rocket up the leaderboard. It's not enough to say, well, if I've got to week 17, I've got some really good players. Because last year, Amari Cooper went nuclear in week 16 against the Jets. Was it against the Jets, or I can't remember who it was, week 16 game? Scored 50 odd
Sounds right.
points, progressed through a week 17, but then he was injured. Christian McCaffrey was a legend throughout the entire season. If you had Christian McCaffrey on your team, there was a 1 in 3 chance that you would make the playoffs because he just pulled rosters to the best ball playoffs. But then when he got
Nice.
there, he was injured. So it's all about going, okay, well, there's 1,364 teams in here in the final. 55% of them or so have Amari Cooper on them. How am I going to get different? And one of the key ways is week 17 correlation. We'll go back a couple of years ago. The winner of Best Ball Mania 2, he game stacked. So he had like 5 players from the Seahawks and Lions game that went nuclear. Everybody in that game seemed to score loads of points. And it just gave him huge leverage because he was betting on fewer things, much like stacking. But instead of stacking just one side, if you're playing DFS, quite often you'll hear about bringbacks. You'll have, Joe Burrow, Jamar Chase, maybe, Tyler Boyd in previous years. And then you'll have a pass catcher on the opposing side because if the Bengals go off, then it's going to put the other team into a pass heavy game script. So they're going to be passing lots. So leaning into that, it's a bit of one where sometimes people over-egg it again, much like stacking, and go a bit crazy with how much it matters. But when you're into the double-digit rounds, if you can break ties by going, okay, well, the Seahawks play the Bears. I've already got Rome Odunze, Caleb Williams, Keenan Allen. I might as well take Zach Charbonnet and bet on the idea that Zach Charbonnet is going to be catching a load of passes from Geno Smith because the Seahawks need to chase the result. So, yeah, little things like that will take your rosters from being good rosters all the way up to potential contest winners.
Yeah, I love that, and I think that's something where you can get an edge on probably the field. But I think you would also agree, and part of this is also your fault that there's a plethora of information out there for people to go and find out how to do these things. I'm confident. Like I said, I'm not big in the best ball, but I'm confident that you already have those week 17 correlations mapped out and who you should take where and graphs and charts and so it's out there
Yeah,
for people to find pretty easily, isn't it?
yeah, definitely. And I mean, like, you can break it down. If you say, I need to advance out of my regular league and hit week 15, 16, 17, those are the things that really matter. Like, you can start looking at, okay, which teams have the highest implied team totals for weeks 15, 16, 17? You'll find, of course, there's teams like the Ravens, the Bengals, who are going to be up there, the Lions, who are very close to the top as well, San Francisco. But then you'll find teams like, I think, who was it? There was a team I was looking at earlier. The Falcons, their implied team total for the 3 weeks is 23.9, whereas Buffalo's is only 24.75. So if you're giving up, 1 point a week, that's not that much. The Falcons play at Las Vegas in a dome. Then they play in New York, which could be weather affected. And then they play at Washington. And we know Washington's defense is going to be poor. But there's also, and it's probably a bit deep to try and get into it right now, but there's plenty of teams where you can go, okay, well, if I've already got a couple of Ravens on my roster, and then I take Xavier Worthy, if I take it's like Jalen Warren, then I'm going to get Pittsburgh playing the Ravens in week 16 and then the Chiefs in week 17. So it's about, you can interweave players who are going to give you week 15, 16, and 17 correlation to your main stacks and just break ties that way. And just, yeah, it's just those little edges which will just help you. But I mean, there's a lot of information out there. And what I'd say is the first year that you really get into tournament best ball, it can be really hard to be profitable. So don't feel downhearted. If you get to week 15 and you've advanced well above, like, if you enter 100 teams, we're expecting to advance 16 of them. That's how
Wow.
difficult it can be. Like, so,
Sure.
and this probably strays into what you wanted to talk about with Underdog, but the advance rate is the top two teams out of each 12 team league. And, if you divide 100 by 12, you're getting 8.3%. 16.7 is
Sure.
roughly two out of the 12. So, yeah, so if you advance above, say you got a 25% advance rate, after week 14, you'd be feeling so happy with yourself. But then in week 15, you're about to be obliterated again because you're playing lots of other really good teams. And
Yeah.
week 15 is the hardest week of the season for the fantasy playoffs when
Mm.
it comes to best ball. Like, there's a lot of downtrodden people on there, and it's very difficult to be profitable in tournament best ball. But, nobody's coming here to break even. We're all trying to win the big prizes, and that's what it's really about.
Yeah. Maybe you can talk a little bit about Underdog or some of these other platforms, the contests they run. The one thing I know about Underdog is probably from almost 2 years ago now, that they went public after a couple of years. They're valued at a multi-billion-dollar company. I mean, it's just insane the amount of people that just flock to Underdog and play on there all the time and all these tournaments and the prizes they're giving away. Best ball's really ballooned. So it's been great for the game, for the industry. But what are your thoughts on Underdog, on the industry itself? The platform, however you want to take this.
I mean, on the Underdog are my guys. Like, I've got good relationships with a lot of people there. When they launched during COVID, and that combination of everybody sitting at home with high disposable income because so many
Yeah,
people were furloughed or getting, money from the government for not doing anything. That just led to so many people being at a draft. There was nothing to do
yeah,
at the time. Being based here in the UK, I was sending them a lot of tweets saying when UK, but
yeah,
and obviously they never opened up to the UK. But I ended up just creating content about Underdog because Underdog were the most open company out there when it came to best ball. So it was like, well, if I want to play best ball and enjoy best ball and understand best ball, I need to look at Underdog's data to do it. They were always very good to me. I mean, the first podcast I ever did was the Underdog Fantasy Show with Josh Norris. And
nice.
it kind of all went from there. Like, I've spent time with them at their Brooklyn office. Like, they're all incredible people, but that's what filters down to their games. They understand their audience. They understand the people who are new to the game, as well as the people who are the sickos who are drafting 500-600 teams.
Yeah,
And really, when it comes to Underdog, they've got contests for everyone. You'll see contests from $2. You'll see contests all the way up into the high stakes. They'll roll out, yes, Best Ball Mania is easily their biggest contest, and one where you can have 150 entries at $25 per entry. So you're talking 37.50 to be able to max enter it. But even yesterday there was a 4 entry max $4 contest. Then there was a $20 10 entry max. So they cater to all types. They play super flex, they play single quarterback, they'll play rookies and sophomores, where the only players in the draft are the rookies and sophomore players. So there's loads of different ways to attack it on Underdog, and by far the best ball platform out there. Like, I'd urge anyone, if you're in a place eligible, to just take advantage of some of the offers that they give for sign up and dive in. And if you're struggling with stuff, there is, as as Jeremy said, like, there's an absolute plethora of stuff out there. Hit him up,
mhm,
speak to me, drop me a DM. My
yeah,
DMs are open. I've got literally tens of articles about how to play best ball. I've got videos on our YouTube channel about best ball basics for beginners all the way up to more advanced strategy. Like, you won't struggle to find ways to optimize how you're doing things.
yeah. And chances are, if you're watching this and it's not live, you're already on YouTube. You can just go over to the FF Sanctuary and find all that information. We'll also link that. Make sure that's linked below for you, so you guys can get over there and get all your best ball knowledge. Let's actually dive into some players. And actually, before I forget, I got a couple of things. So Tyler says yo-yo. So yo-yo right back at you, Tyler. And this is from Scott. In best ball, are there teams you will completely stay away from because offensively they are poor? Does a poor offense matter, or is the cost baked in, I guess?
So yeah, there's definitely an element of that. So this year in particular, we talk about backdoor stacks, which is like, okay, you've hit round 12, you've only got one stack, and you might have been building something. Say you had, I don't know, like Lad McConkey, and you were going, okay, I'm going to add Justin Herbert as my second stack, and then I'll be done at quarterback. I'll have two stacks, and I can start building some correlations, dealing with some weaknesses in my roster. But then somebody snipes you on Justin Herbert, and all of a sudden you're in a bit of a tailspin. You don't want to take a quarterback unstacked. And the way to deal with that is going, okay, so I'm going to look to the Patriots, because the Patriots is a really easy one to stack late. You can get Javon Baker, you could get KJ Osborne, you could get Kendrick Bourne, Hunter Henry, and add Drake May onto it. You could add the Giants and go, okay, I don't have Malik Neighbors, but I'm going to get Wan'Dale Robinson. I'll take a shot on one of the tight ends, and I'll grab Daniel Jones, Jalen Hyatt, Darius Slayton. Or you could be looking at the Broncos. You've got Troy Franklin, Marvin Mims, Bo Nix goes right at the end of drafts. So there's definitely teams that I'm not excited about adding, but quite often it's going, okay, I need a little bit more correlation or a little bit more of a stack if I really want to be able to separate from other teams in the best ball playoffs or other teams within my groups, and saying, okay, I need to make a bet on somebody. Who's it going to be? In terms of teams that I'm kind of lower on, quite low on the Cleveland passing game. Not really a believer that Deshaun Watson's going to turn it around. I think outside of them, not too many kind of stand out. The Buffalo stuff, I haven't been taking too many of the highly priced receivers and tight end, like more Curtis Samuel. If I've got Josh Allen past ADP, I'll add him in. Indy, I don't really enjoy adding the pass catchers too much. I don't mind Josh Downs and AD Mitchell's price in like the 120 range, but going Anthony Richardson and Michael Pittman early doesn't always feel great. And then Vegas, I just struggle. Like their quarterback situation feels grimy. I like Jacoby Myers. I like Devontae Adams. I like Brock Bowers, but I also like Michael Mayer. So it's like, I'm just not sure it can all pan out. So yeah, I mean, the one thing I always say is I'll always take somebody if the price is right. And if somebody falls 12, 20 picks past ADP, I'm quite open to just scooping that value more often than not.
Nice. It feels like to me, and we've been talking about this a lot amongst ourselves. So maybe get some outside opinion. It seems like the Seahawks are super undervalued, especially with Ryan Grubb coming in there. Waldron over to Chicago. I don't know if it was Waldron's fault, if it was Gino's fault, it was Pete Carroll's fault, what happened. But it seems like their group of pass catchers and Gino are guys that you can get later than you should, and they could be a top 15 offense this year.
Yeah, it's I was updating my rankings, and I put together for our subscribers a best ball survival kit where you have all my DraftKings underdog rankings, targets and fades, because rankings I don't really think of a most helpful thing because they lack context. But in my targets and fades, I added Geno Smith into the targets today because he's already starting to rise up draft boards slightly, and I want to be ahead of that. DK Metcalf is a player I've struggled with over the last few years. I think he hasn't really paid off his cost compared to Tyler Lockett, but it feels like this is going to be the offense which can unlock DK Metcalf potentially and really take him to the next level. Last year he had 8 touchdowns and crushed in a bunch of metrics, but if he can get into double-digit touchdowns, particularly with Ryan Grubb talking, or I think it was Geno Smith was quoted as saying that Ryan Grubb told him they're going to lean heavily into play action. Play action is going to allow DK Metcalf even more time to get downfield and get open. And yeah, I just think he could go nuclear.
Yeah. Yeah, he's my redraft wide receiver 12. I think he's going to have a monster season. And I agree with you. I think people are just afraid of Sam Howell. I don't get it. But Gino is going to be the guy there for the year. I think he turns it around pretty easily.
Yeah, I mean,
But let's
it
talk
kind
about.
of.
Oh, sorry.
I was just gonna say it kind of gets lost that Sam Howell just isn't a very good quarterback.
Yeah, very much so. Very much so. Let's move into some players you like, though. Let's talk about some best ball values, maybe some earlier values. I'd say before round 10, or maybe right around there, that you like scooping up in most of your drafts. Because as you said, are you up over 100 best ball drafts yet? Yeah,
Yeah.
nice. What's the number?
I'm not sure to be honest. I would guess it's probably closing in on 200 at the minute.
Nice.
Yeah, but getting into busy season, so definitely be higher than
Yeah,
that in a few weeks' time.
excellent.
The first number is somebody right at the top of draft boards, but I still see him as a value to me. And one thing that I think is worth being mindful of, I draft a lot with Colin Kelly of Rotoviz, and
Mhm.
on Rotoviz they always talk about who are the players who can ascend from where they are and where could they be being drafted next year? And one who stands out to me is Drake London, who's currently his ADP is 14th overall. But I think there's a very realistic chance that we're talking about Drake London next year as a top 6 pick. Like Kirk Cousin last year, he was PFF's QB7. He was the 4th best passer. Desmond Ridder was the 66th best quarterback out of 68 quarterbacks in the league. He had the 60th best quarterback rating. He and then when you look at Kirk Cousins, over the last 10 years, he's been the 4th most accurate quarterback. Last year alone, he had 10 more catchable passes per game than Ridder. When you're talking about Ridder, who had 16 completions per game, now you're going to 26, and what we still expect to be quite a condensed offense. That's massive. I mean, Drake London, he's averaged 4.2 receptions per game through 33 NFL games. That's going to double this year. Drake London is going to have over 8
Mhm.
catches per game. I'm absolutely willing
Oh yeah.
to bet my hat on that. So yeah, I'm very much in
Mhm.
on Drake London. I know some people are playing the I'd like to see it before I believe it approach, but Drake London, when he came out, there was nobody surprised that he went as a top 10 pick in the draft. And now everyone's like, oh, yeah, well, he's only been a wide receiver 3 for the last couple of years. I simply could not care about what he's done in that terrible offense with terrible quarterbacks.
I totally agree with you, Drake London. He's my redraft and dynasty wide receiver 9. He's absolutely going to be a monster this season. You mentioned Desmond Ridder. I mean, they've just been a train wreck over there in Atlanta on offense for years. Arthur Smith, the the hatred within the fantasy community of Arthur Smith's winning, scheme. I think he did a lot more than he should have done, as in terms of getting NFL wins. But absolutely crushing all of the hopes for our fantasy guys. Thankfully, he's out of there. And all 3 of these guys, I think, have the potential. They can't do it all at once, but you got Drake London, you got Kyle Pitts, and you got Bijan. They all have the potential to be the number 1 at their position in terms of fantasy. And I think Drake London is the hardest for people to buy into, but I think he's going to be an absolute monster this year.
Yeah, and I've got more faith that Drake London does it than Kyle Pitts. I definitely think Kyle Pitts is a bounce back, but when I look at
Mhm.
the talent levels between Kyle Pitts and Travis Kelce, Mark Andrews at the top of the tight end positioning, I think the gulf there is bigger than the difference between Drake London and say Jamar Chase, Tyreek Hill. So
Yeah.
I appreciate some people will feel that that's just too much for them. That's fine. I'll keep drafting Drake London. I have no problem with it, and I'll keep feeling confident about it.
Nice. Excellent. I love that. You have another name as well, another wide receiver for us?
Yeah, so here's DeAndre Hopkins. He's currently available 12 spots after Calvin Ridley, despite the fact that DeAndre Hopkins outproduced Calvin Ridley in yards per route ran, yards per reception, receiving EPA, yards per game, and points per touch last year. When drafts opened up and Calvin Ridley was ahead of DeAndre Hopkins, I was like, well, that's going to correct itself. But it doesn't. And it's much harder for players to fall down draft boards because auto drafters will end up selecting them, or people see them at the top of ADP. And it's like, okay, well, they're 4 picks past ADP. I'll just grab them. But I don't believe that's right in this case because DeAndre Hopkins has been excellent for the last 2 years. Yes, he had that sort of lull when he got suspended for PEDs, but ever since he's been great. And we're talking about one receiver who has a pre-existing relationship with his quarterback, and then Calvin Ridley, who, I mean, he was okay last year. He could have easily had some variance go his way and end up being a lot better.
Yep.
But out of the two, I feel so much more confident betting on DeAndre Hopkins.
Yeah, I mean Hopkins has done it for years. He's old. I think people are scared of age. You mentioned Raheem Mostert earlier. I mean, people are scared of age instead of what these guys have actually done, and the fact that they've shown that they haven't lost a step. Yeah, they're older. Yeah, they could have lost a step in the offseason. Yeah, they could get injured maybe a little bit more easily. But if we're playing this game because we're scared of injury, then we're going to miss out on these massive seasons. I'm with you on DeAndre Hopkins. I don't think he's even now, I don't think Calvin Ridley is any better than Hopkins, and Ridley's damn near 30 years old himself.
That's what I was going to say. People say, DeAndre Hopkins is what, 31, but Calvin
32.
Ridley's 29, 32.
Yep.
Okay, Calvin Ridley's what, 29, going to turn 30 this year.
Yep.
Like that difference, like particularly when we're talking about one player who has been elite for an awful lot of his career, I'm more than happy to bank on that. Like the nuance and savvy that you get from the amount of years that DeAndre Hopkins has played with the amount of different quarterbacks, plenty of who have been subpar. I think he knows
Mhm.
how to win in bad situations much easier.
Yeah, and you have, of course, Brian Callahan coming over from Cincinnati. He's going to recognize this right away. They brought in Calvin Ridley, but you just want a guy on the other side who's going to take away coverage. I was thinking this with London and Atlanta. I love the Darnell Mooney and Rondell Moore additions for Atlanta because I think they're good enough to command a little bit of coverage or attention, but they're certainly not good enough to steal targets away. I think Calvin Ridley can steal some targets away from Hopkins, but it's not going to be a significant number. And so, for that reason, I think he's better, but DeAndre Hopkins still could eat and should eat in that Tennessee offense.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yep, and Scott's absolutely right. He missed a ton of time. When he came back, he looked good. And to Tom's point here with Ridley, he almost had like 6 extra touchdowns last season. I was a big Ridley fan. It just didn't happen for one way or another. If you haven't seen the video that I think it was Ian Harditz who put it together of like 4 minutes of Trevor Lawrence almost having an additional 13 touchdowns last season. You should go search it up on Twitter. It's an interesting watch. Calvin Ridley is at least half of those clips, but we digress. Instead of Ridley, who's fine at ADP, go for Hopkins. Do you have another name for us here, Tom, before we get out of these early round values?
So after we talked about Arthur Smith and how much of a scourge he is to our fantasy teams, it
Yes.
probably seems a little counterproductive to be saddling my bags up with Jaylen Warren, but I fully believe in Jaylen Warren. Like over the last 2 seasons, he's had 89 catches, 74 targets last year. The only running backs who had more targets last year were Breece Hall, Alvin Kamara, Christian McCaffrey, Bijan Robinson, and Jahmyr Gibbs. That feels like pretty good company to keep. When you consider also that Warren was the second highest explosive play rate among running backs, only behind Devon Achan. Like the ceiling is so high for him. And going back to the pass catching, he now plays with the 2 quarterbacks who led the league in check down throw rate when they were kept clean last season. So that's, not pressured for it. They're not just dumping it off because there's a pass rusher in their face. They were kept clean, but they were still checking it down. Russell Wilson checked down when clean at a rate of 19% last year. That's like 1 in every 5 throws. Justin Fields was at 13%. Russell Wilson last year threw 27% of his passes behind the line of scrimmage. That's the highest number out of 509 quarterbacks since 2005. He also threw 62% of his passes within 5 yards of the line of scrimmage. It's like part of that you can attribute to Sean Payton not trusting him to throw the ball downfield, but part of it you can just attribute to the fact that Russell Wilson was just trying to keep the ball moving and that he wasn't trusting what he was seeing. And outside of George Pickens, I don't really believe that there's an awful lot that suits Russell Wilson's skill set. Yes, Pat Fryermuth has been talked up, but Russell Wilson's never been good at throwing to the middle of the field because he's a shorter quarterback. We know that's a problem area for those type of quarterbacks. So yeah, I think Jalen Warren can absolutely go nuclear. And I think as much as Najee Harris looked better last year, they're at a point
Mhm.
where the Steelers, it's time to start thinking about whether they want to pay Najee Harris or move on from him. And I wouldn't be surprised if Jalen Warren was out touching him by week 10.
Yeah. We all love Najee Harris over here at the FFU, but we love Jalen Warren too. I mean, both of these backs are going to be awesome. And if Jalen Warren takes over due to injury from Najee or just the fact that he's got more bursts and is clearly better, great. Warren is also cheaper. So go ahead and get him. Absolutely. I love that call. Let's move on to maybe some later sleepers that you have, round 10 or beyond. Who are some names that you like in that range?
This guy's moving up a little bit, but I'm going to take him before he kind of gets out around 10. It's Brian Robinson Jr. And part of this for me is it's twofold. I believe in Brian Robinson. I think that when you
Mhm.
look at what he did last year, it was 4.1 yards per carry. He was steady. He was better in the receiving game than he kind of gets credit for. And then Austin Eckler is coming off an atrocious year by his standards. He hit a career low PFF grade of 60. His career average is 79.6, so it's way below what we'd usually expect from him. Austin Eckler as well. His missed tackles forced per game dropped from 4.2 in 2022 when he was great for fantasy to 2.9 last year. He set a career low in yards after contact per attempt for the sixth straight season. All the signs of decline are there. My co-host on the Sanctuary, Rich, absolutely nailed this one last year. Said he thought that when the end comes for Austin Eckler, it wasn't going to be pretty, and it wasn't.
Yeah.
And I just don't think that we should be saying Austin Eckler is the better talent than Brian Robinson and drafting Austin Eckler ahead of Brian Robinson when the Commanders weren't desperate to land Austin Eckler. Austin Eckler sat out there on free agency for a good few days before finally he took a very cheap deal with the Commanders. Matthew Berry, in his post combine article, Things I Learned from the NFL Combine, talks about how much the Commanders absolutely loved Brian Robinson and wanted to feed him this year.
Mhm.
And then the last point, because I know I'm dragging on with this one, but Cliff
Oh, you're
Kingsbury
fine.
runs a no huddle off. Cliff Kingsbury runs a no huddle offense, which means that the offense, which is out there, quite often stays on the field because they want to keep the tempo up, they want to keep the pace up. Cliff Kingsbury's always designed a good run game, even when his passing game was pretty piss poor. But Brian Robinson will be out there on early downs because that is the role he's suited to. And that's how he's going to end up catching more passes than people think he's going to because he's going to keep Austin Eckler off the field.
Yeah. And last season, even with Antonio Gibson, as much as people love Antonio Gibson, I will never understand why. But Brian Robinson still had 43 targets and 36 receptions. All right. So he's still going to have that role in the passing game. He's also damn near 230 pounds. And he actually runs like it, unlike an AJ Dillon, bigger bodied back who does not run like it. So Brian Robinson,
Yeah.
I love him for as a fantasy asset. He's one of these guys who's probably not going to hit you with a ton of elite weeks, but he's a super consistent, should be a super consistent RB2 for you all year long.
Yeah, and particularly one other thing that's kind of worth mentioning is that as much as Jaden Daniels is a dual threat quarterback, and we know how good he can be in a rushing game, like the man averaged like 11.2 rush attempts per game in college, he isn't a goal line threat. Like he doesn't rush around the red zone. He doesn't score a massive amount of rushing touchdowns, and when he does, they're from outside the touchdown. And because he's got a slimmer build, the Commanders would be absolutely mental if they decided that they wanted to start rushing him around the goal line. Like bad things are going to happen if they do that. Brian Robinson is absolutely the guy who should be on those kind of goal line touches.
Yep. Yeah, we're running a little over, but I have to respond to that and say Jaden Daniels is basically Lamar Jackson. He's probably not to the level of Lamar Jackson, but like you said, he's the slimmer build. He's a super hyper athletic quarterback. He's already a top three rushing quarterback in the league simply by stepping in and starting in an NFL game. RIP Trey Lance and Justin Fields, at least, who won't be starters. But
Oh,
he's going to be creating holes simply due to the threat of him running the football. If Kingsbury's smart, he's going to run some RPO. We didn't see that necessarily a ton with him, but you have to utilize this guy's legs as a threat to stretch the defense. If they're able to do that, we saw in Baltimore that Gus Edwards, J.K. Dobbins, whoever else they threw back there ran for 5 yards a clip, simply because Lamar Jackson was handing them the ball and might not. Right. If Jaden Daniels can, sometimes not hand them the ball and take off for 30 yards down the field, Brian Robinson is going to see some of the biggest holes he's ever seen. And he's just going to take his 230-pound frame and run straight through. I think it's going to be a great year for him.
Yeah, 100%.
Who else do you have as a later round value, Tom?
So sticking with the kind of the rookie quarterback theme, it's Drake May, and I think it's hard not to compare the situations for him and Jane Daniels. Like, yes, there are some holes in Drake May's game, much like Jaden Daniels, but Drake May, I'm so excited about his ceiling outcomes. You're talking about a quarterback who did rush for almost 1,500 yards and 16 touchdowns over his final 2 years in college. I think that he's also probably a more polished passer in terms of the different passes he can make. I think Jaden Daniels' deep ball is fantastic. There's no denying that. Mm-hmm. But Drake May can do certain things in the passing game better. People say, oh, he needs to work on his footwork, this, and this. It's so boring. It's like he needs to get out there. He doesn't need to sit. You think he's going to learn from watching Jacoby Brissett? Drake May played at North Carolina behind an awful offensive line. Drake May can get into the NFL and absolutely learn. He's used to playing behind crappy offensive line. He's used to playing with wide receivers who aren't particularly good. So let him get out there and take his lumps. We saw how detrimental it was to Trey Lance when he didn't get out there and develop. I don't think that Jacoby Brissett is going to be able to hold Drake May off for long. Last year he couldn't get on the field ahead of Sam Howell. So, yeah. What are we really talking about? Jacoby Brissett keeping Drake May, who the Patriots just spent top 5 pick on the bench till November? I highly doubt it.
Yeah, I hear that. I am a Patriots disclaimer. I am a Patriots fan. My homerism does not allow me to like the Patriots prospects for this year. And I have Mac Jones PTSD. So Drake May is not a Mac Jones sit back there and sit in the pocket and get crushed, hold the ball forever and get crushed kind of pocket quarterback. But, I wish they would be able to hold him back. But you make a good point. I don't know that he's learning a ton from Jacoby Brissett. He does need to be out on the field. He will be out on the field. I mean, one of the things that we've seen with rookie quarterbacks is if the team has an early bye, they're more likely to hold those rookie quarterbacks back. For example, J.J. McCarthy, the Vikings have a week 6 bye. It's very possible Sam Darnold, and they have a ridiculously difficult defensive schedule. I think the 49ers are in there, so something else for the Vikings. So, you don't want JJ to get absolutely crushed, but if you're able to hold him out for that week 6 bye, you do Sam Darnold for a month and a half. JJ, I could see him coming in week 7 fresh and ready to go, especially if they can win some of those games. With Drake May, the Patriots have a bye in week 14. I mean, that's just not happening at that point. Just sit him the whole season. So, yeah, I think he gets that out there for at least half the season and, if not all of it.
Yeah, 100% agree with you on all that.
Yeah. And you have one more name. So let's get the last guy out here. Who's your late round value?
Well, look, I mean, we got 53 minutes in the show before I talked about my Ravens. So, yeah, it's Rashad Bateman. And I know how many people have been burned by Rashad Bateman. I mean, like literally hundreds of dollars down the toilet. Hundreds of best ball drafts where I drafted too much Rashad Bateman. But the hype for Bateman has been so consistent from the moment the season ended. John Harbaugh has spoke glowingly of Bateman, unprompted, and that's something I always pick up on a lot. It's like, what do the coaches say? Not when prompted by a reporter. What do they come out with when they just want to get it out there? And both the head coach and the GM, Eric DeCosta, they've gone out of their way to talk up Rashad Bateman. In recent weeks, he did an interview with the Ravens in-house podcast, and he talked about how last year he wasn't sure he was going to be able to play until 2 weeks before the season when, because of the
Right.
Liz Frank injury that he was recovering from. And because of that, because Todd Monken was installing a new offense, eventually he hit a point where he had to allocate the role he imagined for Rashad Bateman to Odell Beckham. So then once the season starts, they never really got up to speed. But this year, Rashad Bateman's healthy. Fingers crossed, touch wood, like touch as much as I can reach.
Yeah.
This is his first healthy offseason since he came into the NFL. He's dealt with some real loss in his personal life off the field over the last few years, dealing with injuries, which we know rookies really deal with very difficult. And I think, yes, if you were talking about Rashad Bateman, where he was going last year, like a top 100 pick or so, I wouldn't be touting him, and I couldn't. But we're talking about a guy going in round 15, 16, and you're getting him one of the most electric offenses in the NFL, attached to a two-time MVP, and potentially he could be the third passing option, if not at worst the fourth passing option on this offense. We know when the Ravens go nuclear, they go nuclear. And if I get 3 weeks out of Rashad Bateman at around 15 cost in best ball, that's absolutely worth it. In redraft, I probably would not want to draft Bateman.
Nice. Yeah, I agree with you. I like the opportunity for whoever's there, but you did mention Devontae Walker. You mentioned Rasad Bateman. I think you're pronouncing Nelson Aguilar wrong, who I think is interesting. Do you have any Nelson Aguilar at all in best ball?
Yeah, I do, because he goes free at the end of drafts. So if you're drafting in
Yeah.
20 round formats like DraftKings or Drafters or FFPC, like we saw Aguilar played from the slot a decent amount last year. I think Isaiah Likely's going to do a decent bit of that this year. But Aguilar was on the field for big plays. Aguilar had good usable weeks, and he seems to have a good connection with Lamar Jackson. So I don't mind it, but I think there's going to be a very big effort from the Ravens to get Rashad Bateman going this year.
Awesome. Real quick, and we don't have to talk a lot about them, but do you just have any names at the end of the draft? Like one name that came to mind as we were talking was Demarcus Robinson. I imagine he's probably free. Who are some wide receivers who you like very late, who could just absolutely give you, like you said, 3, 4 usable weeks that you can take in the last round?
So yeah, I mean, Demarcus Robinson was somebody I was in on very much early on in the off season. He's kind of increased in price since then. Just looking at my exposures, it kind of comes down to stacks and week 17 correlation a bit. It's like that's how I
Sure.
break ties a lot of this range of a draft. I've got a good bit of Darius Slayton. I think he's perennially underpriced. The Giants
Yep.
just gave him like 4 million contract for this year to make sure that he'd be there because they wanted him on the field. And if Malik Neighbors is soaking up all the defensive attention, then Darius Slayton might actually find it a bit easier to get open for the first time in a few years.
Sure.
I like KJ Osborne with the Patriots because there's been reports saying that he could be out there in 3 wide receiver sets, which makes sense. They added him. I've been taking Jalen Tolbert, which may or may not be a good idea, but he's the clear wide receiver 3 on an offense which hasn't added anybody of note. And he did come on down the stretch last year from, I think it was their week 8 by the Cowboys. Everything became much more pass heavy, and he outdid Michael Gallup in a number of stats for the rest of the season. Aside from them, yeah, I don't think there's anybody too much that stands out. I take a bit of Greg Dortch because when he is going to have a defined role, the team seems to love him, and there's lots of positive stuff that comes out about him. Or if I'm on the Falcons, sometimes actually, the one who I take quite a lot of is Josh Reynolds, who is now with the Broncos. And when you think about the Broncos, there's Cortland Sutton there, and then there's a lot of unknown. Whereas Josh Reynolds, he's had a bunch of good, like double-digit PPR games over the last couple of seasons. I think that he could definitely find his way into a decent role for him. And the Broncos play the Bengals in week 17, and I quite like scooping up pretty much all the Bengals. I think they're undervalued. So adding Josh Reynolds on in the last round of draft always makes sense to me.
Nice. I love it. Tom, thank you so much for coming on and just, dropping a load of wisdom on us. It was an absolute pleasure. I know I didn't do a great job of it, but if you could improve upon my little intro of you, can you please tell everyone where they can come find you and how, they can tap more into your brain and win their best ball leagues?
Well, yeah, I mean, like I say, my DMs are open on Twitter. So if anyone ever has any questions about best ball, I'm always happy to answer them. You can find me, it's busy season. Every Monday, I have a podcast with Andrew Erickson on Fantasy Pros feed. We talk rises and fallers in current ADP and the rankings over there, as well as jumping into best ball drafts. Mondays, underdog best ball drafts on our channel, Fantasy Football Sanctuary, which is FF Sanctuary. Also on Wednesdays, DraftKings drafts, loads of best ball strategy videos that pop up. Rich is crushing it with dynasty content there. We're just starting to put our redraft plans in motion and get that stuff churned out. Then all my written work goes through fantasypros.com. There's a good chance for at least one out of every 2 or 3 days there'll be an article from me on there, and that's kind of it. Just keep churning it out and keep going until the season gets here, really, which is what, 62 days away now. So be here before
It's
we know it.
coming.
But yeah, I mean, I just want to say thank you to you, Jeremy. Like I said at the top, I really appreciate what you guys are building here. You've got great production values, really nice content, and fully believe that you guys are going to make a big difference in the industry over the next couple of years.
Well, I appreciate that, Tom. So thank you so much. This over here is Tom Strachan. I am Jeremy Schulman of the Fantasy Football Universe. You can find him where he told you he could find. You could find him. It'll also be linked in the description of this video. We are the Fantasy Football Universe. You can find us at the FFU.com. You can find us on Twitter. We're on TikTok. We're on Instagram for some reason. We're all over the place. So just type in Fantasy Football Universe. Find us posting daily content. So again, Tom, thank you so much. For Tom, I am Jeremy, and we will see you next time.